It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, just dinner with my son and his wife. But that night changed everything. In 1 second, love turned into something I couldn't recognize. A hand I once held to teach him to walk became the same hand that struck me across the face. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply looked at him and realized what I had to do next. This story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment a mother finally stops forgiving. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Dinner had always been quiet in that house. I didn't expect laughter, but I expected respect. That night, the air was heavier than usual. I could feel the tension before a single word was said. My son sat across the table scrolling through his phone while his wife complained about the bills, the lights, the noise, everything. I stayed silent. I had cooked the meal myself, even though my hands hurt and my legs trembled. I thought that serving dinner might remind them of who I was, the woman who built this home, the one who raised him when no one else stood beside us. But that night, I realized that memory fades faster than gratitude. He asked about the electricity bill and said I had left the heater on for too long. I didn't even argue. I just said I was cold. That single sentence broke something in him. He stood up from his chair, his face red, his voice shaking with anger that I didn't understand. I thought he was just tired. But then he did something I never thought I would see in my life. His hand came across my face. Fast, sharp, final. The sound was louder than I expected. My teacup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. The echo of the slap stayed in the room even after he walked away. His wife stood by the sink, smirking. She didn't say anything, but I saw satisfaction in her eyes. Maybe it was because she thought the house would soon be theirs. Maybe it was because she liked seeing me humiliated. I looked at her for a long time, not because I hated her, but because I was trying to understand how I had raised a son who could stand beside that kind of woman. My cheeks stung, but the pain didn't matter. The betrayal did. That was the first time I realized love could turn into pity. When he left the room, the silence pressed down on me. Even the clock on the wall stopped ticking, or maybe I stopped hearing it. I touched my face and felt the warmth of his hand still there. For a moment, I thought about crying, but I didn't. I had cried enough in my life. When my husband died, when I buried my parents, when I worked late nights just to buy my son a new pair of shoes. Tears hadn't solved anything then. They wouldn't solve this. I stood up slowly, picked up the broken pieces of the teacup and placed them carefully in the bin. Each piece felt like a memory. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, quiet nights, when it was just the two of us. I thought of the little boy who once held my hand crossing the street, the one who used to bring me flowers from the garden. I wondered when that boy disappeared and who replaced him. I realized that he hadn't just slapped me out of anger. He had slapped away everything I thought we still shared: love, respect, and the bond between mother and son. After that night, something in me went completely still. I didn't speak for the rest of the evening. I sat alone in my room and stared at the photo on my bedside table. The one where he was 5 years old, smiling, missing a tooth, holding my hand. I wanted to remember him like that, before greed, before pride, before his wife. The house was dark, but I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, not broken, but empty. When morning came, my cheek was still swollen, but my heart felt clear. I realized that I had been living in fear without naming it. Fear of being unwanted. fear of being too old, fear of being a burden. But that slap killed the fear. It reminded me that I still had something he didn't: the house, the title, the power to decide. That night, he thought he was showing strength. He didn't know he was giving me permission. Permission to stop forgiving. Permission to stop protecting him. Permission to finally act. I walked into the kitchen, made myself tea in a different cup, and sat at the same table where it had happened. The same sunlight came through the window, but everything felt different now. The house wasn't just bricks and walls anymore. It was evidence. It was mine. I owned every inch of it, and now I was going to protect it the same way I once protected him. He had shown me what he was capable of. Now I would show him what I was capable of too. He thought that slap would end the argument. It ended something else instead. My silence. People see a mother and think she has always been taken care of. They forget that before love, there was struggle. Before warmth, there was survival. My story began long before that slap. Long before my son grew into the man who could raise his hand against me. It began in small, cold kitchens where I worked nights just to keep food on the table. It began with long days of washing, sewing, and saving, all so my son could grow up with the chances I never had. Every bill I paid, every meal I cooked, every hour I stayed awake, it all went into building him a life better than mine. When my husband died, I didn't crumble. I couldn't afford to. I had one child, one reason to wake up, one reason to keep breathing. He became everything to me. I sold jewelry to pay for his school fees. I skipped meals to keep him fed. I worked 2 jobs just to pay for his education. Every late night was worth it, I told myself. Every pain, every ache, every tear. I believed that love given without limits would be returned the same way. I was wrong. When he finished his studies, I thought my sacrifices were finally over. He found work, married, and moved back into the house I built. I thought having him close would mean safety, peace, and family. But slowly, things started to change. He began speaking to me differently, less like a son and more like a man who believed I owed him something. I started to notice the tone, the distance, the impatience. It began with small things: ignoring my advice, talking over me, dismissing my words. I told myself he was just busy, that life had made him tired. I didn't realize life had also made him cold. The house we lived in was more than walls and windows. It was my entire story, written in bricks and paint. I had built it with my husband, one paycheck at a time, one plan at a time. He handled the construction, and I handled the money. We dreamed of leaving it to our son when we were both gone, not while I was still breathing. But after my husband's death, my son convinced me to add his name to the papers. He said it would make things easier, safer. I didn't know that signature would later become a weapon. Years passed, and my space in that house grew smaller. My room became the corner of my life. My voice in decisions grew quieter until it disappeared completely. They redecorated the house, moved my furniture, decided what food I should eat, what medicine I should take. They started calling my bedroom her space instead of her room. That's when I realized I had stopped being the head of the house. I was now just the old woman they were waiting to replace. The night before he slapped me, I overheard them talking. They were arguing about money, about bills, about ownership. I caught fragments, words like inheritance, papers, and when she's gone. I didn't want to believe it. I closed my door and told myself they were talking about someone else. The next night, when his hand met my face, I understood exactly what they meant. People think betrayal comes in big moments, but it doesn't. It builds slowly, in the missed greetings, in the forgotten thank yous, in the small acts of disregard that grow into cruelty. The slap wasn't the start of betrayal. It was just the moment I could no longer pretend not to see it. After he hit me, I thought about every sacrifice I made. Every night I came home exhausted, smelling of cleaning products and sweat, counting coins for his school books. I thought about the times he promised to take care of me when I got old. The same promise my husband once made before he died. But promises fade when greed grows. I finally understood that my love had become invisible, my worth taken for granted, and my kindness mistaken for weakness. That's when I remembered the deeds, the papers that still held my name, the small, powerful truth sitting quietly in my drawer. I realized that the woman behind this house wasn't the one being pitied in the corner. It was the woman who built it, who earned it, who still owned it. They had taken my peace, but not my power. From that night on, I stopped seeing myself as a helpless old woman. I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped hoping they'd remember what I had done for them. I was done being the background of my own home. They wanted my house. They forgot it was my name on every wall. They wanted my silence. They forgot silence can turn into strength. I gave my son the roof that sheltered him, the food that filled him, and the life that raised him. But in return, he gave me shame. That night, I decided shame would be the last thing I ever took from him. That night, after the slap, the house felt like a stranger's place. The walls that once heard laughter now echoed with silence. My cheek burned, but not from the pain, from the shame. It wasn't the kind of hurt that fades after a few minutes. It was deeper, the kind that stays in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty doorway where my son had just walked out. His wife stayed behind, leaning against the wall, pretending to be calm. Then she laughed. A quiet, cruel laugh that sliced through me more than the slap ever could. She said it was nothing. She said I shouldn't take it seriously. Her words came out soft, almost polite, but her eyes were sharp. I realized she wasn't trying to comfort me. She was trying to erase what just happened. To her, it was a small family argument. To me, it was a line that could never be crossed back. I looked at her and understood something clearly. She enjoyed it. She enjoyed seeing me small, humiliated, powerless. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I walked away, not to rest, but to remember. I stood in front of the mirror in my room. The mark on my face was faint, but I could still feel it. My reflection didn't look like me anymore. I saw someone who had given everything and received nothing in return. My eyes were dry, not because I was strong, but because I was empty. I ran my fingers along the edge of the dresser, the same one my husband had built when we first moved in. He used to say this house would always protect me. I almost laughed, thinking about that now. Protection doesn't come from walls. It comes from people. And the one I had trusted most had turned into my biggest wound. As I looked around the room, I saw little pieces of my life everywhere. A framed family photo, my wedding ring in a dish, the old clock that no longer worked. Each object told a story of loyalty, patience, and love. But that night, all those stories felt like lies. The picture on the wall, my son smiling next to me, looked like a stranger. I couldn't even recognize the pride I once had in that face. It hurt to admit, but I hated that photo. I hated what it reminded me of, the years of sacrifice that led to this moment. When I went to the kitchen to clean the floor, I saw the shattered teacup still lying there. The pieces had dried tea stains on them, small and harmless compared to what had just happened. I picked up each fragment carefully and threw them away. The sound of the shards hitting the bin was the only noise in the house. I stood there for a long time, holding the edge of the counter, breathing slowly, forcing myself not to collapse. In that silence, something inside me shifted. I had always believed that family means forgiveness, that mothers must understand, that age means endurance. But I realized that endurance has a limit. A mother is not a punching bag. Respect cannot be forced by age. It has to be earned by love. That night, I saw what I had raised. Not a man, but someone who had learned that kindness can be taken for weakness. And that lesson came from me, because I allowed it for too long. I thought about the dinners I cooked when he couldn't afford food, the money I borrowed when he lost his job, the nights I stayed up praying for him. I thought about how I had protected him from everything, even his own mistakes. But who was protecting me now? Certainly not him. Certainly not the woman standing in my kitchen pretending nothing had happened. I felt humiliation, yes. But under it, I felt something stronger. Anger. Not loud anger, not wild or violent. The quiet kind. The kind that builds slowly until it becomes something unshakable. I walked back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just looked at the window and watched the night go by. Every hour that passed, my mind got clearer. I remembered that my name was still on the property deed. I remembered that my husband had left everything to me. I remembered that this was my house, and that they were just living in it because I allowed it. That slap didn't just humiliate me, it woke me up. When the morning light finally touched my room, the shame was gone. What replaced it was calm, the kind that comes before a storm. I realized I didn't need revenge that shouted. I needed one that changed everything quietly. The kind that didn't need words, only actions. I looked at the family photo again before leaving my room. I didn't hate it anymore. I just felt nothing. That was worse. Love dies loudly, but disappointment dies in silence. And mine had just been buried. He thought I would forgive him. He thought time would make it fade. But he didn't understand. I don't forget, and I never repeat lessons that hurt. That night, I didn't cry. I just sat at the table long after they had both gone upstairs. The lights were dim, the food cold, the sound of the clock steady. I stared at the empty chair across from me, the one where my son had sat hours earlier. I could still see the movement of his hand, the anger in his eyes. The sound that followed. The sound that split something inside me that could never be fixed. I ran my fingers over the side of my face and it still hurt. But it wasn't the kind of pain that needs medicine. It was the kind that changes you. I had lived through worse in my life. Poverty, loss, loneliness. But this was different. This came from the person I built my whole life around. This came from the child I carried, raised, and trusted. The pain wasn't from the slap. It was from realizing that my love had turned into his entitlement. Somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as something in his way. A wall between him and what he wanted. I had thought that if I kept giving, he would keep caring. But giving had made him greedy, not grateful. I went to my bedroom quietly, closing the door so I wouldn't hear their laughter upstairs. My cheeks still throbbed as I sat on the bed, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't reach for comfort. I reached for the drawer. Inside, it was a brown folder, thick, old, and heavy with papers that held my life in signatures. Property deeds, bank statements, insurance, everything my husband and I had built together before he passed. I opened it and looked at the top page, the title deed of the house. My name, not his, mine. For years, I had told myself I'd update it, share it, make it easier for him later. But I never did. I was too busy trying to hold the family together. Now, that small act of delay was my salvation. I realized in that moment, I still had control. Quiet, legal, final control. He thought I was weak because I was old. He thought he had the power because I stayed silent. But he forgot who I was before I became a mother. He forgot I was a woman who built everything from nothing. I laid the papers on the bed one by one, reading every line carefully. Every stamp, every signature, every proof of what belonged to me. It was all there. He had no idea how much of his comfort depended on me. The roof over his head, the savings he used freely, the car parked outside. All of it traced back to me. He had slapped the hand that fed him, but he didn't know that same hand still held the pen that could take everything away. The night grew colder, and I didn't sleep. I sat there with a cup of tea and thought about every choice I had made in life. Every time I said yes when I should have said no. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid arguments. Every time I let him believe he was right, even when he wasn't. I had raised him to think I would never fight back. That was my biggest mistake, because I should have taught him that kindness isn't weakness, and silence isn't surrender. As I looked at the papers again, I didn't feel revenge. I felt balance. For once, things made sense. He thought age made me powerless. He didn't understand that age makes you fearless. I had nothing left to lose. Not respect, not love, not pride. He had taken all that. Now all I had left was the truth. And the truth was written in black ink, sealed and legal. When the morning light started to fill the room, I folded the papers neatly back into the folder and placed it on the table. I made a decision before the sun rose. I would call my lawyer. I would take back everything he assumed was his. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to die a victim in my own home. He had made his move. Now it was my turn. I looked around the room one last time. The furniture, the curtains, the photographs, everything he thought was his inheritance, but it was all mine. And the best part? He didn't even know it yet. That was my advantage. He thought the slap gave him power. It had only given me purpose. By sunrise, I wasn't the same woman who stood at that dinner table. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. I had one thought left in my mind, clear and sharp as glass. If he could raise his hand to me, then I could raise my signature against him. He didn't know it yet, but that slap was his last victory. The next day would belong to me. Morning came quietly. The same walls that had witnessed my humiliation were now about to see my decision. The light from the window felt different, not warm, but sharp. It reminded me that the world keeps moving, no matter how much someone tries to break you. I didn't wake up angry. I woke up ready to take control of what was already mine. I made tea like I always did, but I didn't drink it. I sat at the kitchen table with the brown folder in front of me. My hands didn't shake. My mind was clear. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. He had handled my husband's affairs years ago, a quiet man who knew every corner of our life's paperwork. When he heard my name, he asked how I was doing. I told him I needed to meet. He didn't ask questions. He said, "Come any time today." I told him I'd be there in an hour. I didn't tell my son where I was going. He was still asleep upstairs, maybe thinking the night before had already faded into forgiveness. That's what he always believed, that no matter what he did, I would forgive. That my silence meant weakness. He didn't realize silence is also the best mask for planning. Before leaving, I looked around the living room. Everything looked normal. The furniture, the framed photos, the books on the shelf. But I didn't see a home anymore. I saw evidence. Every object reminded me of how much I had given and how little I was respected. I closed the door behind me and walked down the street without looking back. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. At the lawyer's office, I laid the folder on his desk. He opened it carefully, scanning the documents. I told him I wanted the house transferred entirely into my name. No joint ownership, no shared rights. I wanted full legal control restored. He looked surprised, but didn't question me. I told him I also wanted eviction notices drafted for any tenants living in the house without legal claim. That included my son and his wife. My voice was calm when I said it. He nodded slowly and began typing. Then I told him something else. I wanted to freeze the joint bank account that my son managed under my name. I wanted new documents for single ownership. I wanted every trace of his access gone by the end of the day. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. I had spent a lifetime fixing other people's mistakes. Now I was fixing mine. When I signed the new documents, I felt no guilt. My lawyer looked at me and said softly, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I said yes. Completely sure. I wasn't punishing my son. I was teaching him the value of consequences, something I should have done years ago. After everything was filed, he handed me the updated papers. My name was there again. Single, firm, legal. I looked at it longer than I should have. It felt like I had taken my life back one signature at a time. He told me the eviction notices would be delivered the next morning. I thanked him and left. As I walked home, I passed a shop window and caught my reflection. I didn't see a defeated mother anymore. I saw a woman who remembered who she was before motherhood took her name. I saw someone who had been quiet for too long. Someone who finally understood that the strongest form of revenge is peace. When I returned home, my son was in the kitchen, acting as if nothing had happened. He smiled, pretending the slap never existed. I smiled back, calm and steady. Inside my bag were the documents that would remove him from the very house he thought he owned. He had no idea, and I didn't owe him an explanation. That evening, I sat in my room again, the same place where I had once felt small. But this time, I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was waiting for justice. The kind that doesn't need shouting. The kind that arrives with a letter and a stamp. I folded the papers neatly, placed them beside my lamp, and turned off the light. My cheek didn't hurt anymore. My heart didn't either. I felt something else instead. Power. Quiet, steady, earned power. He thought I was just his old mother. He forgot I was the woman who built the walls around him and the one who could take them away. The next morning, I would. The next day began like any other, but nothing about it was normal. I woke up before sunrise, calm and ready. I had my breakfast alone, just toast and tea, but it tasted different, like control. The house was still quiet. Upstairs, I could hear them moving around, unaware of what was coming. I didn't rush. I waited. Some things are better when delivered slowly. By late morning, the movers arrived. 3 men, polite and efficient, carrying boxes and tools. They didn't ask questions, just followed instructions. I told them to start with the guest room and the upstairs wardrobes. They nodded and got to work. The noise finally drew my son downstairs. He came out of his room half-dressed, confused. He looked around at the men carrying his belongings and asked what was happening. I didn't answer right away. I just continued sipping my tea, flipping through the newspaper like nothing was wrong. He started to panic when he saw the suitcases. I could see it in his eyes. That slow, creeping realization that something was no longer in his control. I reached for my handbag, took out a single envelope, and slid it across the table. My hands didn't shake. I didn't need to say much. The letter spoke for me. He opened it, read the first line, and froze. His name was gone. His access revoked. The title of the house had been changed. The joint account had been closed. Everything he thought belonged to him now legally belonged to me. He looked at me like he didn't recognize who I was. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he had forgotten that before I became the quiet old woman who cooked his meals, I was the woman who built everything he stood on, the one who signed the papers that made this roof possible. I watched him read the letter again, this time slower, trying to make sense of it. His lips moved, but no sound came out. That silence, that stunned silence, was louder than any apology he could ever give me. His wife came down next, holding her phone, demanding to know why men were touching their things. I didn't even look at her. I just said one sentence, steady and calm. The law says this house has one owner. She laughed at first, as if I was joking, but then she saw the papers in his hand. Her face changed. Not anger, but fear. The kind of fear greedy people feel when they realize they've lost something they thought they owned. She started shouting, saying it wasn't fair, that I couldn't just throw them out. I didn't respond. I just stood there, quiet, watching them unravel. My silence was louder than her screaming. The movers continued their work, carrying out the last of the boxes. I could see the panic turning into disbelief. The woman kept grabbing at my son's arm, whispering something to him, but he just stared at the papers, defeated. I didn't need revenge that day. I already had justice. It was written in ink, signed, sealed, and delivered. No shouting, no violence, just the weight of reality finally landing on the people who thought I would never fight back. I thought about the night before, the sound of his hand across my face. That sound had become my reason to act. And now, his silence was my closure. Before they left, he tried to speak. I could see his lips tremble, his pride breaking piece by piece. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of my anger or my forgiveness. I simply turned and walked away, leaving the papers on the table. The same table where he had once humiliated me. Now it held his lesson, cold and legal. The movers finished their work by noon. The last thing they carried out was the family photo that had hung on the wall for years. I didn't stop them. Let the memories go with the furniture. I didn't need them anymore. This house had been filled with too many ghosts already. Ghosts of loyalty, sacrifice, and love taken for granted. When the door finally closed behind them, the air felt lighter. I sat down in the chair where he used to sit and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not happiness, not victory, just peace. The kind that comes when you know you've finally stopped letting people hurt you. He thought he could slap me and walk away as if nothing had changed. but everything had changed. I wasn't his frightened mother anymore. I was the woman who had reminded him, through law, not words, that respect is earned, not inherited. That day, when his footsteps faded down the path, I smiled to myself. Not because I'd won, but because I had finally finished something that should have ended long ago. He took my dignity once. I took back everything else. The moment the truth sank in, everything changed. My son just stood there, frozen, still holding the eviction papers as if the letters on the page might somehow rearrange themselves into forgiveness. But they wouldn't. His wife was the first to move, loud, frantic, and trembling. She stormed toward me, her voice sharp, words tumbling out too fast to make sense. She called me cruel, heartless, ungrateful. I let her speak. I had listened to her noise for years, and I knew the only answer she'd ever understand wasn't in words. It was in silence. When she saw that I wasn't reacting, she got louder. She pointed toward the walls, the furniture, even the rug, claiming everything inside belonged to her now. Her voice cracked with desperation. The neighbors might have heard, but I didn't care. Let them hear. Let them see what happens when greed wears a smile. She turned to my son, demanding that he stop me, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, defeated, his pride crushed under the weight of the very papers he thought he'd never see. She didn't understand that this wasn't about revenge. This was about balance. For years, I'd lived in fear of upsetting anyone, walking quietly, speaking softly, trying not to disturb their comfort. But that day, their comfort collapsed, and it wasn't anger that brought it down. It was truth. Legal, stamped, and undeniable truth. I had no reason to shout. The documents had already spoken louder than any argument ever could. The wife tried to grab the envelope from his hands. When he wouldn't let go, she turned on him instead, accusing him of being careless, stupid, lazy. The same woman who smirked when he hit me now looked at him with disgust. I watched as her arrogance crumbled in real time. She'd built her confidence on money that was never hers, on a house she didn't own, on a mother she never respected. And now all of it was gone. I finally spoke, slow and calm. I told her to pack whatever she could carry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Authority doesn't need volume. It needs certainty. I reminded her that the movers had orders to clear only her things, not mine. Her face went pale. She shouted one more time, something about betrayal, but I didn't listen. I turned my back and went into the kitchen, the same place she once told me I belonged. For the first time, I actually felt like I did belong there, but not as their servant, as the owner. From the window, I watched her storm through the hallway, dragging her bags, slamming doors, cursing under her breath. She looked smaller now, not because of her size, but because she no longer had power. My son followed her out, still in shock, still trying to piece together the version of his life that had just collapsed. When the door finally closed behind them, I sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, but now felt clean. I ran my fingers along the wooden surface of the table, the same one I'd bought decades ago when my husband was alive. I thought of all the meals, the laughter, the hard days, and the good ones. Everything came back, except the guilt. That was gone now. It wasn't joy I felt. It was relief. A relief so deep, it made my hands stop trembling for the first time in years. I ate dinner alone that night, a simple meal, warm soup and bread. No shouting, No laughter dripping with cruelty. Just peace. Every spoonful tasted like justice. Quiet, steady justice. Later, I walked through the empty rooms. Their things were gone. The air was still. And for the first time in a long while, I could breathe without feeling watched. I opened the window in my room and let the night air in. It was cool and clean, carrying the smell of rain. I looked outside at the dark sky and whispered to myself, not as a prayer, but as a truth. It's over. The wife thought I was too old to fight back. She thought the years had made me soft. But she forgot that age doesn't take away strength. It refines it. It makes it quiet, patient, and exact. She laughed when I was slapped. She thought that moment made me powerless. But that same moment became the seed of her undoing. And that night, as I lay in bed, I realized something simple but final. Some people only learn respect when they lose everything they took for granted. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel sorry for him. I only felt peace. The morning after felt quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just still. The air was heavy with rain. I sat by the window sipping tea, listening to the faint dripping from the eaves. The house was mine again, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like repair. Slow, necessary, and earned. Every corner looked different now, cleaner, lighter. But the silence had a weight to it, the kind that only comes after a storm. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, uneven, then pounding. Sharp, desperate knocks on the front door. It was early, the kind of hour when even the birds hesitate to sing. I didn't move right away. I knew who it was. You don't forget the sound of someone who once raised his voice at you. The knocking grew harder. I took another sip of tea and waited. Finally, I stood up and went to the door. Through the small glass panel, I saw him, my son. His clothes were soaked, his hair unkempt, eyes red and swollen. He looked smaller than I remembered, older even, though only a night had passed. He wasn't the same man who slapped me. That man had been full of arrogance. This one was empty, hollow. He stood there, breathing heavily, clutching the railing as if his body couldn't hold him up. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but the rain drowned his voice. I didn't open the door. I just watched him. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who used to run home from school, muddy shoes, bright eyes, proud of every small thing he did. Then I remembered the man he became, the one who raised his hand against the mother who raised him. That memory was louder. He started knocking again, harder this time, shouting through the door, begging me to listen. He said he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that he lost his temper, that it was the stress. Excuses, all of them. Words meant to soften me like they always had before. But I wasn't that woman anymore. My heart had learned the difference between guilt and manipulation. I didn't hate him. I just stopped believing him. The rain poured harder, hitting the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. He kept talking, his voice cracking, pleading for forgiveness, for a chance to fix things. I let him speak until the words ran dry. Then I turned away and walked back to the kitchen. Through the window, I could still see him, kneeling now. On the wet porch, hands clasped, the same son who once told me I was nothing but a burden. It's strange. Seeing someone beg doesn't always bring satisfaction. Sometimes it only confirms how far they've fallen. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt tired. Tired of being the one who always forgave first. Tired of letting love blind me to cruelty. He stayed there for almost an hour, the rain washing over him. I knew what he wanted. To come inside, to find comfort, to believe I'd forget. But some lessons are meant to last. Letting him in would erase everything I'd fought to reclaim. It would tell him that respect could be lost and bought back with tears. I wouldn't let that happen. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The rain slowed. When I looked again, he was gone. Only wet footprints remained on the porch, fading slowly into the wood. I stood there for a long time, staring at them until they disappeared completely, just like the man I once thought my son was. The rest of the day passed quietly. No calls, no noise. I made myself a small lunch, sat in the same chair, and looked around at the walls that had finally gone still. The house was silent again. Not empty, just peaceful. I could finally breathe without fear of shouting or humiliation. That evening, I lit a small candle in the corner of the room. Not for grief, not for guilt, but for closure. The kind that doesn't need words. The flame flickered softly, steady like my heartbeat. I thought about everything that had happened. The slap, the humiliation, the papers, the rain. Every moment had led to this one truth. Sometimes you have to lose a child to find yourself again. He had begged at my door that morning, but I didn't open it. Because love without respect is just obligation, and I had spent too many years confusing the two. When I went to bed that night, the house was quiet again, truly quiet. And for the first time, that silence didn't hurt. It healed. The days after the storm were the calmest I'd known in years. The shouting was gone. The footsteps were gone. And the tension that had once filled the air had vanished. The house didn't creak from anger anymore. It breathed again. The silence that used to scare me now felt like company. It wasn't emptiness. It was peace. I spent the first week cleaning slowly, not to erase memories, but to reclaim space. Every room had a story, most of them painful, but cleaning them felt like closing unfinished chapters. I opened every window, let the air run through the curtains, and allowed sunlight to touch corners that had been ignored. Dust carried the weight of years, and as it lifted, so did my heaviness. There was no hurry. I cooked only for myself. Simple meals, quiet music playing in the background. I sat by the window every morning with a cup of tea, watching the world move on, and for the first time, I didn't feel left behind. I was part of it again. No one yelling, no one waiting for me to serve, no one reminding me of my place. My place was wherever I chose to stand now. A week later, I called the lawyer and finalized the sale of the house. I didn't feel guilt. That house had been built with love, but it had also become a place of humiliation. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a museum of betrayal. Every wall, every doorframe carried the echo of a moment I wanted to forget. Letting it go wasn't loss. It was cleansing. When the money came through, I didn't spend a single moment thinking about what my son might feel. That part of me, the part that always worried about his comfort, was gone. I donated a portion of the money to a women's shelter. They were building a small annex for elderly women who had nowhere to go after family abandonment. I told them they could name it after my late husband. He had been a good man once. He didn't deserve to be remembered through what his son became. The rest of the money I used carefully, enough to secure my future and buy something small for myself. I found a cottage near the sea. It wasn't large, but it was beautiful. White walls, blue shutters, and a small garden at the back where wildflowers grew. The first morning there, I stood on the porch and watched the horizon. The ocean was calm but endless, stretching beyond what my eyes could see. I hadn't seen anything so free in years. That view became my reminder that freedom doesn't come from running away. It comes from removing the people who cage you. My days became quieter but fuller. I planted herbs, read books I'd long ignored, and wrote small notes in a journal about things that made me smile. Not big things, just moments. The smell of coffee, the sound of waves, the laughter of children passing by. Peace wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, steady, and real. Sometimes I thought of my son. Not every day, but some mornings when the sky looked heavy, I'd remember his face from when he was young. The boy I raised still lived somewhere in those memories. Soft-spoken, full of dreams. I grieved for that version of him, not the man he became. The man who hit me didn't exist anymore, at least not in my world. I'd buried him with my forgiveness. I kept one photograph, just one, from when he was a child. It sat in a frame on my bedside table, not as a reminder of him, but as proof that even the worst hearts once came from innocence. It helped me sleep better, knowing that I could forgive without forgetting. Evenings were my favorite. I'd sit on the porch as the sky turned gold, the air cool against my skin, the sound of the sea just beyond the dunes. I no longer waited for anyone to come home. I was already home. I didn't need company to feel whole. I didn't need family to feel loved. I had rebuilt that within myself. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, asking if I ever got lonely. I smiled and told them the truth. Loneliness is not being alone. Loneliness is being unseen in your own house. I had lived that way for too long. Now I was seen, even if only by myself. And that was enough. At night, when I turned off the lights, the silence didn't echo like before. It rested. The house rested with me. Every wall, every window, every breath reminded me of the same truth. I didn't win against my son. I simply took back what was always mine. Dignity. That was my peace. Not revenge, not pride, just quiet, lasting peace. Every story has a point where noise ends and meaning begins. Mine ended the morning after the rain stopped. I sat on the porch of my cottage, the same spot where I now begin every day. The sea was calm. The air smelled like salt and new beginnings, and the sky had that pale gold light that only appears after a storm has spent itself. It was the kind of peace that doesn't ask questions. It just exists. And that morning, I realized something simple. I hadn't lost a son. I had found myself again. People talk about motherhood like it's a duty that never ends. They say a mother forgives everything, but no one talks about the cost of endless forgiveness. It takes your voice first, then your pride, and then your soul. I forgave my son for years, for neglect, for cruelty, for disrespect. Every time I did, a small part of me disappeared. When he slapped me, it wasn't just a moment of anger. It was the final piece of me breaking off. That's why I didn't fight him that night. I didn't scream or cry. I just decided it was time to stop disappearing. Sitting there now in the stillness of my own life, I understood the full weight of that choice. Taking back control didn't mean revenge. It meant survival. It meant teaching him and myself that love without respect isn't love at all. It's dependence disguised as devotion. I had spent my whole life making sure my son never went without. In doing that, I forgot that I wasn't meant to live without either. The world had always told me my strength was patience. But patience, when given to the wrong people, becomes permission. I had permitted too much. Now, every quiet breath I took in this little seaside cottage reminded me that I didn't need anyone's permission to exist in peace. I kept my days simple. No more rushing to please, no more waiting for apologies that would never come. The silence that once frightened me had become my comfort. It was honest. It never lied. It never judged. In that silence, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. Thoughts that were calm, steady, and free from guilt. Sometimes people from the village would visit and ask about my family. I'd smile and tell them that my son lives his life, and I live mine. I didn't need to explain further. The truth doesn't always need witnesses. It just needs peace, and I had it now. In the evenings, I often sat by the window with a candle burning beside me. The flame reminded me of how small strength can look. Just a flicker, yet enough to hold back darkness. I realized that's what I'd become. Not loud, not angry, not vengeful. Just steady, unshaken. A small light that refused to go out. I still thought of him sometimes. Not with hate, not with longing, just with distance. I hoped he'd learn what I finally had. That power built on control is weak, but power built on peace is unbreakable. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't wish him well either. I simply wished him the awareness that I had found too late. That every slap, every cruel word, every moment of disrespect was his lesson to learn, not mine to carry. As the sun went down that evening, the water shimmered like glass, reflecting the light just enough to make everything glow. I thought of all the women like me, mothers who gave too much, forgave too quickly, and lost themselves in the name of love. I wanted them to know something. Peace doesn't come when they apologize. Peace comes when you stop waiting for it. I had written my final letter weeks earlier, not to my son, but to myself. I kept it folded in a drawer, a reminder that I had made it through. It simply said, "You did not fail as a mother. You failed only when you forgot you were also a person." As I looked out at the fading light, I finally spoke aloud to no one but the sea. He slapped me once and thought it meant control, but that slap freed me. The waves rolled gently against the rocks, as if answering back. Then I turned to the camera, my story now told, my peace intact, and I said quietly, "He thought I'd always forgive him. He was wrong. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's a decision. And this time, I chose myself. Tell me, if your own child humiliated you in front of the world, would you cry for their love or stand for your own worth?" And with that, I closed the book on that chapter. Not with tears, not with bitterness, but with something far more lasting. Dignity.